Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, I'm talking about what I think is the best year in music. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So this actually comes from Alex over at Beer and Vinyl. I'll put a link down below to his channel if you want to go back and check him out. He threw this question out to the vinyl community, what we thought was the best year in music. Because I think, first off, music is so subjective. I think it's probably the most subjective form of art we have. And this question is even more subjective because everyone's going to have a different opinion and everyone's going to have a different reason why they have that opinion. And when I started thinking about it, it actually took me a while to come down on what I thought the answer was because, 1967 was a great year in music. 69 was a great year in music. I could went with 71, 73. 77 was, the explosion of punk music. 79 was a great year. 84 was a great year. 87 with, Guns N' Roses and everything that was coming on in the late 80s there, that was a great year. 91 I could have went with. 98 was a great year. Even into the 2000s you had, 2003 and 2004 were both incredible years for music. So was 2008. So I had so many great choices to pick from. It was really, really hard for me to sit down, really narrow it down to just one year. And there's a couple of ways people can look at this. You can look at it as, try to be objective and think, what is the best year? What year were the best albums released? But I chose to look at it a different way. I chose to look at what was the biggest year for me in music. Like, what year did the majority of the albums really speak to me and really kind of change me musically? And when I thought about it that way, I think it was actually a pretty easy choice for me. And that was 1994. It was a year that I was 14, turning 15 that year. And my music interests had really shifted. In the late 80s, early 90s, I was listening to, Guns N' Roses, Poison, Metallica, Motley Crue, bands like that. And then once grunge hit in the early part of the 90s, I was really locked into that scene, Alice in Chains, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, all the greats from that era. But then by 1994, music was really changing. Grunge was pretty much gone at that point. And what was coming out of that scene, I think would really help form me musically, for the next 30 years. And there were so many great albums that were released in 1994 that made me want to be a musician. And I started my band the next year in 1995, and I've been playing, nonstop for the last, 29 years now. So I'm going to run down a long laundry list of incredible albums that came out in 1994, and then I'm going to give you my top 5 albums for that year. So some of the incredible albums that were released in 1994, you got Alice in Chains, Jar of Flies, which was an EP, and it was still part of that grunge scene, but it was kind of like the tail end of grunge. You also had Black Sabbath, Cross Purposes, so it was coming back with Tony Martin. You got Beck, Mellow Gold, which I need to buy a copy of that on vinyl. I don't know, it's an incredible album. It's one that I didn't initially like, but I warmed up to over the next couple of years after that album came out. You got Nine Inch Nails' Downward Spiral, which is another kind of along the same lines, where I don't think I really truly appreciated that album until several years later. But that was a great album that came out that year. ICP Ringmaster came out that year. Super Unknown by Soundgarden. Motley Crue's self-titled album, which I know gets a lot of grief from fans, but I would highly recommend going back and listening to that album because there is some really good stuff on that album, even though Motley Crue themselves even pretend that album never existed. You also got Pantera, Far Beyond Driven, which I saw Pantera on that concert. I saw them on that tour the following year. One of the best shows I've ever seen. Almost also one of the most violent pits that I've ever seen in person. You also had Tim McGraw, Not a Moment Too Soon. Great country album. That's the great thing about 1994 is really the 90s in general, where it wasn't just great rock music that came out over that decade. There was great country music. There was great rap. Rap drastically changed over the course of the 90s. R&B. So many great albums came from so many different directions over that entire decade. But 1994 was also, I think, kind of, like I said, the splintering of rock music, and that's where we kind of got some of the variations in genres. So you got moment not a moment too soon was another good one. Pink Floyd, The Division Bell, which I think, after how terrible, at least I've never liked A Momentary Lapse of Reason. It should have been a David Gilmour solo album, but The Division Bell is, I think, outside of like those big albums that Pink Floyd released in the 70s, I think it's second to only those albums. So it's a great one that came out that year. The Offspring Smash, which I think still is the highest selling independent album of all time, came out that year. Johnny Cash, American Recordings. Johnny Cash's career was basically over by the early part of the 90s. And then that was the album that really kind of brought him back into the mainstream. G Love and Special Sauce, their self-titled album, is absolutely fantastic. Weezer's self-titled album, which actually just got a big anniversary edition released. Beastie Boys' Ill Communication, which I think after License to Ill, I think people kind of stopped paying attention to Beastie Boys for a while. And then Ill Communication came back out and, really exploded them back onto the scene. Rancid Let's Go came out. Hootie and the Blowfish, Cracked Review, which I think was one of the highest selling albums that year. Rolling Stones, Voodoo Lounge, Alice Cooper, The Last Temptation, NoFX, Punk and Drublic, which I think is one of the greatest punk albums ever recorded. Rusted Root, When I Woke, which I think is an album that's really kind of flown under the radar largely over the last 30 years. Oasis, Definitely Maybe. Boyz II Men 2, it's a great R&B album, maybe one of the best R&B albums of all time. Usher's self-titled album came out that year. Bad Religion, Stranger Than Fiction, which I think is probably, maybe I'd probably put it in their top 3 Bad Religion's albums of all time. Blues Traveler 4, which just got a big vinyl reissue just recently, which I've been asking. It's probably been one of my number one asks, for a reissue over the last several years. The Notorious B.I.G. Ready to Die, I think is probably one of the top 5 rap albums of the 90s, came out that year. R.E.M. Monster, the Cranberries, No Need to Argue. Danzig 4 was a great album. Nirvana, MTV Unplugged came out in 1994. That was the last, I think it was a great send-off for what Nirvana was and what they meant to the music industry. The Black Crowes, Amorica came out. Tom Petty, Wildflowers. Eagles, Hell Freezes Over, which was their big reunion tour. Been a big fan of the Eagles ever since I was a kid. My dad used to listen to the Eagles a lot. And, they're a band that kind of, after they broke up in the, the late 70s, early 80s, the members of the band went off and did some great things. But it was that Hell Freezes Over tour that I think really cemented them as, one of the biggest American rock bands of the last 50 years. TLC, Crazy Sexy Cool, which is another album I need to get on vinyl. I've picked it up a couple of times, and for one reason or other, I always end up putting it back. And then the last one I've got on my list is Pearl Jam Vitalogy, which is the album that I think I kind of lost interest in Pearl Jam after the release of that album, even though they did. I've definitely circled back around to all the stuff that they released after Vitalogy, and there's some really good stuff. I don't know why. I think Vitalogy came out, and 1994, 1995 is when I really got heavily into punk music, and especially like older punk, like 70s and 80s punk music. So I think what Pearl Jam did after Vitalogy, I was just in a different place musically. So those are all fantastic albums that shaped me as a person. But those are all albums I would not have in my top 5 for 1994. The album I've got at number 5 came out November 1st. This is the album that really helped transition rock music from grunge to, alternative rock. Even though 16 Stone, a lot of people look at this as a grunge album, it's not. If you compare this to what was going on in the Pacific Northwest, I think it was very different things. But this was like I said, this is the album that really kind of shaped alternative rock music. This is also the album that I remember sitting down and listening to this album nonstop when this album came out. And this is the album that really kind of cemented the idea in my head that is what I want to do. I want to be able to play music, as a 15-year-old kid. The album that I've got at number 4 is definitely not as well known as any of the other albums that I've talked about. But it's an album that means a lot to me, and it's probably one of my top 20 favorite albums of all time. It was released August 2nd, 1994, and that is Rotting Pinata by Sponge. So Sponge is a band that I found out about. It was like right at the beginning of the school year. I was going into my sophomore year in high school, and I think it was like first or second hour of school, there was this channel that they'd play in all the classrooms. It was called Channel 1. Actually, Channel 1 is where Anderson Cooper got his start from. But I remember right at the beginning of the school year, so it had been like September, they had Sponge on there talking about this album. And I went out after school that day, bought this on cassette, and 30 years later, it's probably still one of my most played albums over that time span. And it's also an album that I'm probably a little embarrassed to say how many copies of this album I have on vinyl. I think I've had up to at least 5 or 6 copies. I sold a couple of them over the last couple of years, though. The album that I put at number 3, I think some people might be a little surprised by this one, because I think a lot of people probably would think that I would have this at number 1, at the very worst number 2. This album came out February 1st, 1994, and that's Dookie by Green Day. This is my entry into punk music. Now, granted, I didn't get into a lot of other punk music until I heard And Out Come the Wolves in 1995, and that's when I got into some older stuff, got into Operation Ivy, got into The Clash, got into the Ramones after that. But this was my entry point. And this was, I think, a lot of people's entry points also. It's the highest selling punk album of all time. It sold well over 20 million copies. It was a huge album, and I think it absolutely dominated that summer in 1994. I remember I even had friends that weren't into alternative rock or grunge or anything like that. They were more like, I'd say, more, I guess, mainstream rock fans that even love this album. So the album that I've got is the second best album of 1994. I might get a little pushback for this one because it's not actually a studio album. It's technically a compilation, but it was released October 4th, 1994, and that's Pisces Iscariot by the Smashing Pumpkins. I've loved this album. This is hands down my favorite Smashing Pumpkins album, and as great as Siamese Dream is, and Melancholy is, and even Gish. Go back and listen to Gish if you haven't listened to that in a long time. This is the album there that, yes, this is all B-sides, outtakes, but I think if any other band had released this album, it would be seen as one of the best albums of the 90s. And yes, this album I think is probably mostly known for their cover of Landslide, because it was a huge track when it was released. But, beginning to end, there is not a bad track on this entire album. So the album that I've got at number 1 is not only an album that I think is the best album of 1994, I think it's one of the best albums of the 90s and probably one of my top 10 albums of all time. It was released on June 7th of that year, and that's Purple by Stone Temple Pilots. I love Core. I thought Core was a great album, but I think on Purple, Stone Temple Pilots really, I think, expanded their sound, kind of broke away a little bit more, because I think a lot of people looked at Core as kind of like almost like a copycat grunge album. But I think with Purple, they showed that they were much more than that. Musically, they could go in a lot of different directions. So many different influences they threw into this album, and it just worked. And this is an album that, if I were to rank 90s albums, I would probably put this at, it would definitely be in my top 3. I think Versus by Pearl Jam is the best album of the 90s. Then after that, I think I would probably it'd probably be a tie between this and probably In Utero for number 2 and 3. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. I'd love to know what you guys think of this. What do you guys think is the best year in music? And it could be, like I said before, it could be for, a year that you think musically is just the best, or one that just means the most to you. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.